ovarian reserve, and they do not respond very well to our ovarian stimulation. So whenever we see these kind of women, we should think about, before starting our treatment protocols, about what could be the dose and what kind of protocol will be better, bearing in mind that these women could likely be poor responders. And nowadays we are talking a lot about the underlying genetic factors which could be there in these women. So despite giving normal dose of gonadotropin, there could be possibility of FSH receptor polymorphism or LH beta gene variants may be there, and this could be the reason why the patient has not responded very well. Patients with past history of chemotherapy or radiotherapy, when the ovarian reserve is being damaged, as we know, chemotherapy agents may target the ovarian tissue and make a patient, may have a premature ovarian failure, or past history of radiotherapy also can damage these ovaries if they are covering the pelvic area. So it's always better to discuss with these patients prior to going for the surgery for the chemo or radiotherapy to preserve the fertility. If otherwise they haven't done that, and if they go for a cycle after the therapies, they are likely to be poor responders. Past history of uterine embolization for the fibroids, and coming to the very important point is the ethnical background. We quite often see that Indian women who are undergoing IVF, they have ovarian aging is found to be 6 years older than the Caucasian counterparts. There was a good Spanish study which looked at about 180 women of Caucasian origin and 180 Indian women, and they found that the ovaries of Indian women were 6 years older compared to the Caucasian women. And also there was a nice study which was from US, where they looked at the women, the American women, and they compared the ovarian reserve of same age women who are Indian but American origin. So they found that these Indian American women had lower ovarian reserve in the same age groups in comparison to the American women. So it's very important to bear in mind that we are, as such in India, we are dealing with women who are already having a low ovarian reserve because of the ethnic background. So when this group of people, they looked at, they need to be a common definition. How will we define these patients with poor ovarian reserve? So initially there was Bologna criteria, which was given by the ESHRE working group on poor ovarian response in 2011. So this Bologna criteria, they talked about there should be at least 2 of the following 3 features to define a patient with poor ovarian response. So either an advanced age, maternal age of more than 40 years, or any other risk factor for poor ovarian response, a previous poor ovarian response where there were less than 3 oocytes collected with conventional ovarian stimulation, or if there was any abnormal ovarian reserve test, either the antral follicle count of 5 to 7 follicles or an AMH between 0.5 to 1.1 nanograms per ml. Apart from this group concluded that in addition, if the patient had 2 cycles of poor ovarian response, even after they had maximal stimulation, that itself was sufficient enough to classify the woman as a poor ovarian responder in the absence of any other criteria mentioned. But however, this Bologna criteria had some problems. So what the problems were that all these 3 group of women, although a woman who has a young woman who has a low ovarian reserve and is associated with the previous episode of poor ovarian response, and another woman who is a young woman with a normal ovarian reserve but 2 episodes of poor ovarian response, or an older woman who is more than 40 years with a normal ovarian reserve and only 1 previous episode of poor ovarian response. All these 3 women have different etiologies and different management strategies, but they all have been grouped together under one banner when you look at the Bologna criteria. And also Bologna criteria does not clearly identify a young woman who has low ovarian reserve and who does not had a previous ovarian stimulation cycle, who is going for the first time of ovarian stimulation. So looking at all of this, the Bologna criteria was not very good in identifying the patients with poor ovarian reserve. So our management strategies were not properly targeted. So then what did this group came up in 2016 with a more detailed stratification of low responders from a poor ovarian response to a poor prognosis concept. And this was the Poseidon criteria, which was a patient-oriented strategies encompassing individualized oocyte number. So what they focused on is about both the oocyte quantity as well as the quality was looked at for the stratification of the patients with poor ovarian response. And the focus, that is the number of the oocytes which are retrieved, are very important to get at least one euploid embryo transfer. So it's eventually the number of oocytes and the euploid embryos what we have is going to determine the live birth and the pregnancy rate of these patients. Also, this was good enough to set the expectations of the patients. We can counsel the patients, give them realistic expectations, and also it helps the clinicians to make plans for the further treatment in order to reduce the time to pregnancy in this group of patients. So this Poseidon criteria classified patients into 4 groups: group 1, 2, 3, and 4. The group 1 are the young patients who are less than 35 years of age, with adequate ovarian reserve parameters with an AFC of more than 5, AMH was more than 1.2, and with an unexpected poor or suboptimal ovarian response. So these women are young women with good ovarian reserve, but for some reason they did not have a good ovarian response during the first cycle of stimulation. And then these are again subdivided into 2 groups. Subgroup 1A, which had less than 4 oocytes retrieved after stimulation, and subgroup 1B, which had 4 to 9 oocytes retrieved. Group 2 are older patients more than 35 years of age with adequate ovarian reserve parameters, where the antral follicle count was more than 5 and AMH was more than 1.2 nanogram per ml, but they had an unexpected poor or suboptimal response. These are also divided into subgroups 2A and 2B, which were depending on the number of oocytes, less than 4 or between 4 and 9. Group 3 are younger patients, less than 35 years of age, with poor ovarian stimulation parameters. So the pre-ovarian stimulation parameters were low, with less than 5 AFC or AMH 1.2, less than 1.2. And group 4 are older patients with poor ovarian reserve parameters right from the beginning of the stimulation. So the very important thing, we need to look at the association between the number of eggs and the live birth. This is a nice paper from 2011 from Sunkara and her group, which talks about the number of eggs and the pregnancy live birth rate. So if you see the graph on the right side, when the patient had between 1 to 4 oocytes collected, the pregnancy rates were very low. It was just between 5 to 10%. So very low pregnancy rates are there when the patients had eggs collected between 0 to 4. So they had very poor response. Between 4 to 9 are the ones which had suboptimal response. And as the number increases, it becomes static once it reaches 15 to 20 eggs, beyond which we're not going to have a much higher pregnancy rate. So the number of eggs to have a maximum live birth rate is around 15. That is what we have to target. But unfortunately, in women with low ovarian reserve, we cannot expect such numbers to be collected. So coming to the ART calculator. So the Poseidon group gave us an ART calculator, and with this ART calculator, based on the age of the patient and the number of oocytes collected, we can predict the minimum number of oocytes which are required to get one euploid blastocyst. So this helps the clinician in better planning of the specific treatments. It provides objective information to the patient so that they are more prepared both emotionally as well as financially, because as we know that repeated IVF stimulations can be financially as well as emotionally draining for the patient. There was a very good study which looked at the reason for dropout rates in subsequent IVF cycles. So when a couple undergoes an IVF cycle, when they were called to go for another cycle of IVF, one of the most common reasons for dropout was poor response in the previous cycle. So because of the poor response in the previous cycle, most of the patients, they become disheartened and they lose interest in continuing further treatment, and that's one of the reasons for dropout. So it's very important that when we have these numbers, we can counsel the patient efficiently and prepare them emotionally as well as financially prior to starting the treatment itself. So that helps them to stay in the program, and of course if they stay in the program, the likelihood of ending up with a positive outcome is more. So how many oocytes do we need to get an euploid embryo? It again depends on the age of the patient. As we know, the age of the patient is a very important biomarker to predict the success of IVF. So somebody who is aged less than 38, we need at least 9 oocytes to get an euploid embryo. Somebody between 38 to 40, we need 14 oocytes to get one euploid embryo. And between 41 to 42 years of age, we need about 32 oocytes to get one euploid embryo. And between more than 42 years, we need about 80 oocytes to get an euploid embryo. So if you can see between a span of 38, just in the span of 4 years, there is a marked change in the number of oocytes which we need to get a euploid embryo, which indicates the egg quality gets very poor beyond 38 to 40 years of age group. So it's very important to look at what are the various markers which we can use to predict the ovarian reserve in this patient and the cutoff values of these markers. Age, which is a very important biomarker. We can take into consideration the FSH levels, day 2 FSH levels. If they are more than 11 IU per liter, it's going to indicate that she's going to be a poor responder. If the AFC is less than 5 to 7, and if your AMH is between 0.5, less than 0.5 to 1.1 nanograms per ml. But is it only the ovarian reserve markers which are enough to predict the ovarian response, or we need to look at something else? So it is ovarian reserve versus ovarian response. All these women who have good ovarian reserve, they may not be good ovarian responders. So it's very important to understand the difference between the ovarian reserve and the ovarian response. So Gendro in his group in 2011 came up with something called as follicle output rate, FORT, F-O-R-T, which means it looked at the number of antral follicles which are present on the start of the stimulation and number of the pre-ovulatory follicles on the day of the trigger. What they found was, if the number of follicles which are present on the day of the stimulation, at least 80% of them, they go for a pre-ovulatory stage, then it's an adequate response. That means it is a satisfactory response. She's a good responder, irrespective of the number of the antral follicle count, whether it is 4 or 10 or 15. If 80% of them are going into a pre-follicular stage, pre-ovulatory stage, they are the ones which are good responders. So this is an expected ovarian response. But if only 30% of the follicles from the start of the stimulation are going to go for the pre-ovulatory stage, then the patient is a hyporesponder. She has not got an expected ovarian response, or a suboptimal response is there in this group of patients. Okay. So then they thought about that, is it just the pre-ovulatory follicles which is enough to predict the success rate, or there is something more to it? And then they came up with follicle to oocyte index. It's not just the pre-ovulatory follicles which are important, but is the number of oocytes what we have collected is more important when we look at our clinical pregnancy or our live birth rate. So at this Carlos group in 2018, they came up with follicle oocyte index, which is a more better predictor compared to FORT in predicting the ovarian response. So if the patient at the start of, they looked at the antral follicle count at the beginning of the ovarian stimulation compared to the number of oocytes collected. So if the number of oocytes collected are more than 50% of the expected response, then it is a normal ovarian response, irrespective of the number of antral follicles which are there. It can be either 4 or 15. But if the number of follicle oocytes collected at the time of retrieval, if they are less than 50% of what is expected from the day 1 of stimulation, then these patients are poor responders. So coming back again to our Poseidon criteria, where we look at the 4 groups. So the group 1 and 2, if you look at them, the requirement and the management of these patients are different to the group 3 and 3, because the group 1 and 2, they are the hyporesponders or they are the suboptimal responders. These are the group of women who have good ovarian reserve, but this group of women have not responded well to our stimulation. So we need to look at what could be the reason why did they not respond to our stimulation. And then group 3 or 4, they are the expected poor responders. Again, when we look at group 3 and 4, the management of group 3 is different to the group 4, because group 3 are the younger women, the women who are less than 35 years of age, And though they may have a low ovarian reserve, we can capitalize on these women because there is a good chance of pregnancy in this group of women because the age is on their side. So talking about these patients who are coming into the group 1 and 2, they have an initial slow response to stimulation in terms of the estradiol levels, the follicular growth. They may need longer duration of stimulation and they may need more cumulative FSH dose despite having the right ovarian parameters. So in this group of women, it's not just the AFC and AMH, which is sufficient enough to predict the ovarian response. It is important to realize that these are the hyper responders who raise the question of ovarian sensitivity to the FSH stimulation which we are giving to these people. So now how will we manage this group of patients? So these are the ones who have poor ovarian response. They are not going to be they are not the sensitive ones. So either your gonadotropin dosage is low, or there could be an underlying genetic factor, environmental factors such as smoking, or the patient has high BMI, so we have not selected the right dose for this patient. Nowadays, we are talking about oxidative stress, which could be a reason in this group of women. If there was asynchronous follicular development, so there are two different cohorts of follicles which are growing and we are unable to reach the objectives. Or it could be some technical issues where the trigger was not given properly, the timing of the trigger was not appropriate, or at the time of egg pickup, there were some issues such that the pickup did not go well in this group of patients. So whenever we look at patients who are expected good responders, but we have collected less number of eggs than expected, we need to think in all of these parameters. So what could we do is either increasing the dose of your FSH in the subsequent cycle. So a few studies have shown that by increasing 50 to 75 IU of FSH in the subsequent cycle, we can probably give her a little bit better response. This group of patients particularly need LH supplementation. So if you were only giving recombinant FSH in the cycle, we could think about adding LH either in the form of recombinant LH or HMG preparations can be used. We need to have a synchronized cohort. We can synchronize the cohort by using luteal phase estrogens. They may need a longer duration of stimulation. We need to relook at our trigger strategy. What did we give for trigger? We probably need to go for a dual trigger or change the trigger which we were giving before. And last but not the least, the new things what we are coming up is we need to look at embryo pooling and dual stimulation protocols. Group 3 and 4, they could be having an underlying genetic factors such as FSH receptor polymorphisms, or there could be some immunological parameters which we need to look at. This could be because of acquired causes, particularly the young women with the group 3, the Poseidon group 3 women. It could be either because of their previous surgeries or previous radiotherapy or chemotherapy which they would have had. Certain environmental factors and lifestyle factors such as smoking, high BMI, environmental factors, the workplace environment can have an effect on the ovarian reserve parameters. And then group 4, which is a age-related decline. They are the genuine poor ovarian responders. They have the diminished ovarian reserve. So coming to the various strategies, we'll just discuss one after other the various strategies which we can use in this group of patients. So luteal phase estrogen can be looked at, and the theory behind it is in this group of patients sometimes they may have a luteal FSH rise, and this can reduce the luteal follicular recruitment. So better synchronization of the cohort can be done by giving them a luteal phase estrogen. This estrogen can increase the number of FSH receptors on the granular cells, leading to improved response to the FSH stimulation. So this increases the number of oocytes and embryos and gives us a better pregnancy rate. And there is a decreased chance of cycle cancellation in this group of patients. The ovarian stimulation protocols, when we look at poor responders, so there are various protocols which we can use. We can use either an agonist protocol with an agonist in either a long protocol, short protocol, or a microdose floor protocol. On the GnRH antagonist protocol, we'll talk about the natural cycle and the modified natural cycle, and then coming to the embryo pooling and the dual stimulation protocols. So when we look at these protocols in this the GnRH agonist versus the antagonist protocol for various age group patients who had diminished ovarian reserve. So this was a retrospective study by Huang and his group, which compared the agonist versus the antagonist protocol in about 1200 women with poor ovarian reserve. So they found that there were lower cycle cancellation rate, higher implantation rate, and higher live birth rate in young poor ovarian responders. That is the Posidone group 3, but it was not there in the Posidone group 4 following the agonist protocol. So maybe the agonist protocol is going to make a comeback in this poor ovarian responders. So it showed that the agonist protocol is more effective for young poor ovarian responders. Then this is another study from 2013 and 14, which compared the GnRH antagonist protocol was associated with higher cancellation rate due to poor ovarian reserve compared to the agonist protocol, particularly in patients with less than 4 oocytes in the previous controlled ovarian stimulation cycles, and in patients with expected poor ovarian response, which is the group 3 and 4, thus raising a concerns about the effectiveness of the agonist protocols in these poor ovarian responders. But then a very recent study from 2019, so I picked up 2 studies from RBM Online and Fertility Sterility, which are very recent studies from 2019, which showed that there was no difference in the cumulative live birth rate in poor ovarian responders patient according to the Bologna criteria, irrespective of the type of protocol used, whether it was agonist or antagonist, it did not make much difference. But so now coming to the modified natural cycle for IVF. So they looked at the poor responders who had high day 3 FSH levels, and for these couples, there was oocyte donation was the last resort. So this was Paul Deveroy and his group, which looked at this particular study from 2004. This looked at 25 out of 78 cycles which were performed. 32% of this cycle did not reach the stage of oocyte retrieval. And then among the cycles which reached oocyte retrieval, 16% of these cycles, no mature oocytes were retrieved. And among the cycles where the oocytes were retrieved, only 43% had reached to the stage of embryo transfer. And out of all the 78 modified natural cycles done, no ongoing pregnancy was achieved. So this group concluded that modified natural cycle does not offer a realistic option of parenthood in patients who had high FSH level on day 3 of the cycle, and the previous poor response was there to ovarian stimulation. So modified natural cycle was not considered as a very good option according to this study. Then there was another paper in human reproduction in 2012 by Nick Polizos and Christopher Blockhill and his group, which looked at the live birth rate following the natural cycle IVF in women with low response according to the Bologna criteria. This was a retrospective cohort study looking at 164 patients who underwent 469 natural cycles between 2008 to 2011. And patients were stratified as poor responders and normal responders according to the Bologna criteria. So the live birth rate in the poor responders were significantly low compared to the control group, and they concluded that natural cycle IVF has very limited potential in the poor ovarian responders irrespective of their age. So even this study was not looking much favoring the natural cycle IVF. Then live birth rates was another study from human reproduction in 2015. They looked at the live birth rate after modified natural cycle, comparing it with high dose FSH stimulation in antagonist protocols. So they found that live birth rate was significantly higher in modified natural cycle compared to high dose GnRH antagonist cycle in poor responders. So they said that both the modified natural cycle and high dose antag cycle, they give a low chance of live birth rate, but modified natural cycle, it's more patient friendly. So because of the lesser injections and lesser cost, the modified natural cycle is more patient friendly and gives a slightly better chance than high dose FSH protocols. But so this data can be helpful in counseling our patient who do not wish to undergo oocyte donation prior to abandoning the treatment. So this group of patients who do not want to go for oocyte donation and they want to abandon the treatment cycle, maybe modified natural cycle could be a better option as they are low cost and more patient friendly. Then from ESHRE guidelines in 2019, the ovarian stimulation guidelines from ESHRE, again they talk that modified natural cycle is probably not recommended over the conventional protocols for predicted poor responders. So the natural cycle IVFs, the advantages are they are more simple and more lighter treatment. They are less cost, they are more cost effective, and also emotionally they are not draining. And consecutive cycles are possible. So we can pull in more number of eggs and more number of embryos is possible. But at disadvantages to this are in a natural cycle, you may end up, we don't know, we have to just monitor the LH surge. So we may end up with premature ovulation in 10 to 40% of this patient. We may not end up collecting the egg, oocyte retrieval may not happen in 5 to 15%. Difficult scheduling these cycles, and 50% of this patient may not end up with an embryo transfer. So that's for all these reasons, natural cycles did not gain a good uphold. Then this another, nowadays we are talking a lot about this dual stimulation. So the concept, what this dual stim is based upon is, in each ovarian cycle, the follicular development, it happens in waves. There are 2 to 3 cohorts of follicles which start to grow and regress during these ovarian cycles. So because if there are 2 to 3 waves of folliculogenesis which is happening, if we are able to capture this before they undergo regression, we may be able to collect more number of eggs in one cycle, so that the patient can go for 2 cycles of stimulation, and it will reduce the number of months which will pass by and maximize the chances of pregnancy in this particular group of patients. So this was a paper from 2015 from Ubaldi and his group, which compared the follicular versus luteal phase stimulation during the same menstrual cycle in patients who had reduced ovarian reserve. And it looked at the euploid blastocyst rate in these group of patients, whether the luteal phase stimulation gives us good quality oocytes or good blastocysts or not. So they've looked at patients who had AMH less than 1.5, AFC of less than 6, and less than 5 oocytes were retrieved in the previous cycle. These patients were included in the study. No statistically significant difference was found in the number of retrieved oocytes or M2 oocytes or biopsied blastocysts per stimulated cycle in the follicular phase or the luteal phase stimulation. So they concluded that between the follicular phase stimulation and the luteal phase stimulation, the euploid blastocyst rate was same. So we can get, in fact, some studies have shown that the blastocysts from the luteal phase stimulation were of much better quality than those on the follicular phase stimulation. Kiran, I'm not able to share the screen.
Ma'am, your slides are visible, ma'am.
Okay. Just look at your end.
Yes, ma'am. Slides are visible, ma'am. Ma'am, can you unshare and share it again?
Yeah, I'll do that.
It's visible, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay. So now coming to the dual stim protocol. What is this dual stim protocol? So what we do is give the patients to do an antagonist cycle starting from the day 2 of the cycle, and then we give to these patients agonist trigger and go for egg collection, and then 5 days after the pickup, we start the second cycle of follicular stimulation, and then again an agonist trigger, and we collect the egg. So we make the embryos freeze all is a strategy which we have to follow, and then embryo transfer is performed in a subsequent frozen embryo transfer cycle. So this is another paper which talked about duostim. In order to maximize the number of oocytes which are retrieved, it was a multi-center study and a SWOT analysis was done. This was again a group from the Ubaldi's group had done this. It was in 2018. So luteal phase stimulation, they said, that resulted in higher mean number of oocytes collected. However, the fertilization rate, the blastocyst rate, the euploidy rate, and clinical outcome after euploid single embryo transfer was comparable in this group of patients. And number of patients with at least one euploid blastocyst increased from 42% with the follicular state stimulation to 65% in this group of patients who had luteal phase stimulation. So what are the strengths of this study? The strengths of this study were higher number of oocytes were collected and embryos were obtained per cycle. More patients obtained competent blastocysts per ovarian cycle. There was no difference in the competence between the oocytes obtained from the follicular phase or the luteal phase. But the weaknesses were there was higher number of stimulations cancelled in the luteal phase. There was no RCT or cost effectiveness analysis done. Freeze-all approach was mandatory. It could be applied only to poor responders, but we don't know if we can apply it to the normal responders. The opportunities are it might reduce time to obtain at least one competent embryo in a single menstrual cycle. It might be better tolerated from the patients than the consecutive FPS cycles. Theoretically, it reduces the dropout rate. It may increase the knowledge regarding the mechanisms of the follicular recruitment and ovarian physiology. But the threats to this were cost effectiveness. It increases the total dose of gonadotropin administered than the conventional stimulation protocol. Few biological, gynecological, obstetrical, and neonatal evidences are available for the safety of this procedure. So what the SWOT analysis concluded was the strengths of this approach is very promising. However, we need more studies in the future to limit its weaknesses, shed some light on its threats, and realize its opportunities. So we need to look at in the future if we can apply this to more of the normal responders or not. And also we need to see if they are going to be more cost effective. Then coming to embryo accumulation. So the duostim again is embryo accumulation, but sometimes we go for embryo accumulation in a consecutive cycle. It's a successful approach to treat poor responder, creating a situation which is similar to the normal responders where we have good number of embryos to transfer. So consecutive follicles cycles can be done before the follicular reserve is depleted, and it's a very good approach, but again the downside too is the cost factor. And this was another paper in 2017 from RBN Online which commented that with additional oocyte which is retrieved, the chances of cycle cancellation are lower and an enhanced live birth rate, particularly in the Poseidon 3 group. So because these are the young responders. And again from X-ray guidelines, it commented that antagonist and agonist protocols are equally recommended, and they said that more than 300 IU of gonadotropin is not recommended for predicted poor responders. So this was a paper from 2010 which compared the daily fixed doses of 300 IU, 450 IU and 600 IU. They found there was no significant difference in the maximum estrogen levels, stimulation days, M2 oocytes, number of embryos transferred, clinical pregnancy rate or cancellation rate between the three groups, and daily dose of FSH beyond 300 IU increases the cost burden to the patient without any additional benefit to this group of patients. Then dual trigger for the ovarian for the stimulation in poor responders is what is more recommended. So dual trigger for the final oocyte maturation with the GnRH agonist along with the standard dose of HCG, it significantly increases the number of oocytes retrieved, the number of mature oocytes and the oocyte maturation rates. Then recombinant LH. LH has a good role to play in maintaining adequate concentration of the intra-ovarian androgens, and it promotes the steroidogenesis and follicular growth. So addition of LH in poor responders, it significantly increases the number of oocytes retrieved with a relative increase in the clinical pregnancy rate. So this was a study from 2014 with Lehart and his group which showed that more oocytes, higher clinical pregnancy rate when recombinant FSH and LH was used together compared to only recombinant FSH. So there was a 30% increase in the pregnancy rate in this group of patients. But then another meta-analysis of 8 trials did not show a significant improvement of clinical pregnancy rate with the use of recombinant LH. But we have more evidence to say that LH should be added in these group of patients. So there was another study from 2011 which said that in patients up to 35 years of age, they did not appear to benefit from recombinant LH. But patients between 36 to 39 years of age, there was significantly higher implantation weight when the recombinant LH was added. So clinical higher, although does not significant, but there was no significant ongoing pregnancy rate per started cycle. Then Humaydan and his group also showed there was a significant benefit in adding LH in women over 35 years of age. Coming to DHEA, so the Gleicher and his group had initially commented that using DHEA will increase the AMH, it increases the number of oocytes retrieved, the quality of the oocytes, and more euploid embryos are there in this group. But further studies have shown that DHEA did not increase the response to poor ovarian responders. It did not increase any of the ovarian reserve parameters. So there was no increase in the testosterone levels in the follicular fluid after the administration of DHEA. And then again, the ESHRE guidelines showed that there is no evidence that adding DHEA to this group of poor responders increases the live birth rate or ongoing pregnancy rate in poor responders with IVF treatment. So now coming to the testosterone therapy. So now we are talking more about using testosterone in these patients with poor responders. This is a paper from 2019, a very recent paper, which says that meta-analysis of the various RCTs using testosterone co-treatment in poor responders found that addition of testosterone in ovarian stimulation protocols has significantly increased the number of retrieved oocytes, number of embryos, the clinical pregnancy rate, and live birth rates were better compared to the control. Then this is another paper again from 2019, which shows that the testosterone supplementation may play a beneficial role in follicular genesis, but the evidence from the published trials is weak and it falls short of drawing robust conclusion regarding the effect of testosterone in poor responder. So indeed, published studies have used inconsistent doses and duration of testosterone in this stimulated protocol. So what most often the studies what are available to us for the testosterone protocols are either they have given testosterone for very short duration of 20 to 21 days or very high doses of testosterone. So these studies are not very conclusive to say that whether androgen supplementation is going to make any difference to our stimulation. Then from 2019, the ESHRE guidelines on ovarian stimulation says that there is inconsistent evidence that adding testosterone pre-treatment in ovarian stimulation will improve the ovarian response in terms of the number of oocytes retrieved and the clinical outcomes in terms of the live birth rate in the poor responders. This is because of insufficient data on the dosages, the duration of administration, and safety. We cannot recommend that you can use testosterone until large RCTs are available. So now we are waiting for this large RCT from Polizos and his group, the T-Transport trial, which is using GnRH agonist response for these poor responders with 2 months of testosterone gel prior to the IVF stimulation versus placebo. So once we have the information from this T-Transport trial, we will be able to apply testosterone more routinely in our practice. And again, growth hormone, again a controversial product. Some say it's useful, some say it's not useful. So how does this growth hormone act? Is it increases the sensitivity of the ovaries to gonadotrophin stimulation, and it enhances the follicular development. It enhances the quality of the oocyte by accelerating and coordinating the cytoplasmic and nuclear maturation. And the GnRH releasing factor supplementation helps to improve the pregnancy rate. So what do these studies say? There are a few studies from 2015 and 16. They have reported that greater number of overall and M2 oocytes, better fertilization rate, better embryos, both top quality embryos and cryopreserved embryos in the GnRH treated cycles. But other studies have shown that there is no difference in the number of overall and M2 oocytes. There were no improvement in the embryo quality and did not make any difference to the clinical pregnancy or live birth rate. So there are two groups of people groups of studies. Some say it's useful, some say it's not useful. But whatever collective evidence we have from small RCTs, they have shown that the adjuvant GnRH growth hormone during ovarian stimulation may help in improving the live birth rate in this poor responder. So despite the possible beneficial effects of these poor responders on live birth rate, the evidence is too limited to recommend a routine use of growth hormone in these prior to the ovarian stimulation. So we've got heterogeneous studies, small studies, and they have used, and most of these studies have used different protocols for growth hormone and variable doses of growth hormone, anywhere between 4 IU to 24 IU have been used in the various protocols. So we need more RCTs with more defined doses to say that it is going to be useful to all the patients of poor responders. However, there could be one subset of patients who may benefit from the growth hormone. So use of adjuvants such as coenzyme Q, as we talked that oxidative stress could be one of the reasons for a poor response. And so the oxidative stress and mitochondrial dysfunction, which has been put forward as one of the pathophysiological mechanisms, the use of antioxidants such as coenzyme Q can be started as a co-treatment, particularly in the young patients who are poor responders. This is a very recent paper from 2018. So what did they do in this RCT was they gave this patient pre-treatment of for women who are less than 35 years of age group. In the Posidon group 3, about 186 patients were included in this study. They gave coenzyme Q 200 milligrams 3 times a day for 60 days prior to the IVF cycle. And what they found was there was an increase in the number of oocytes retrieved, the fertilization rate, high quality oocytes and embryos were better in the group which received coenzyme Q compared to the women who did not receive. The clinical pregnancy rate and live birth rate, however, did not reach the statistical significance. So probably coenzyme Q may revolutionize the protocols which we use for stimulation in our POR patients. But however, it is premature to conclude this, and we need more RCTs before we apply to all the group of patients. Then another paper from 2014, which also talks about CoQ supplementation improves the patient's response to ovulation induction and decreases fetal aneuploidy in older women between 35 to 43 years of age group. Then a Cochrane meta-analysis in 2017 also showed that probably antioxidants may be beneficial in this group of patients who are going to go for ART. So whether oxidative stress has a role in the pathogenesis of hyperresponse still needs further investigation, but however, CoQ may have a role in this group of patients. And nowadays we are talking a lot about the autologous PRP and its role in improving the ovarian reserve. So what they do with this group of patients, these are very recent papers from 2019. I've picked up 2 papers, and what they showed that injecting autologous PRP into the ovaries, they did it under the ultrasound guidance, under general anesthesia, 2 months prior to the IVF. So the preliminary results from this study suggest that there is a trend towards better implantation and live birth rate in this group of patients who had the PRP injections. Interestingly and encouragingly, the FSH levels decreased and AMH levels increased in this group of patients following the PRP treatment. However, the number of patients in these publications are insufficient to draw robust conclusions. So in this group, there was about 40 patients where 20 were in the arm of PRP and 20 were in the arm which did not receive PRP. So however, we would need more RCTs, and lot of RCTs are going on in this area. They are awaited to validate this preliminary and optimistic hope. So maybe PRP may be the future for this group of patients, and also lots of studies are there looking at giving stem cells, but stem cells again are in a very experimental phase where we can laparoscopically inject the stem cells into the ovaries to improve the response to stimulation. And this is another very recent paper from RBM Online from 2020, which talks about in vitro activation of the follicles. So this is more in patients of premature ovarian insufficiency. In vitro activation of the oocytes could be possibly effective, and it is not detrimental to the ovarian follicles. What they did was hyposignaling disruption alone was used for in vitro ovarian cortical fragmentation, followed by this ovarian tissue, the ovarian cortical grafts were put back into the body, and this was sufficient enough to promote the follicular growth in patients with POI. So it showed that the AFC was increased in about 9 out of 11 patients. They had a few pregnancies and there are still some ongoing pregnancies in this particular group. But the results of this preliminary study, they are encouraging, but we need more data in prospective RCTs before we can validate it and apply it to a larger population of patients. So with this, we come to the end of our talk about the poor responders. So a few concluding points. Poor ovarian responders is an indication of the reduced size of the primordial follicular pool, and the resulting eggs which will result from this are also likely to be of suboptimal quality. We have to be very mindful when we do our pelvic surgeries relating to the ovaries, particularly the surgeries of ovarian endometriomas and laparoscopic ovarian drilling in PCO patient, which may lead to iatrogenic poor ovarian reserve. Patients who are undergoing chemo and radiotherapy should be counseled about the impact of this treatment on fertility, and we should offer cryopreservation of the oocytes or the embryos to this group of patients. Poseidon group highlighted the importance of tailoring the stimulation based on the chance of each woman to obtain a euploid blastocyst as a main goal of stimulation. AFC and AMH are useful markers of ovarian reserve in addition to the chronological age, but AFC and AMH, they are only a static snapshot of the individual ovarian reserve, which do not reflect the dynamic nature of the follicular growth and response to stimulation. The follicle oocyte index is a better tool to determine the ovarian reserve, and adequately we can exploit the stimulation. We should never refuse a patient stimulation or IVF solely based on the ovarian reserve test. Particularly the group 3 Posidons, they are the ones which we can capitalize upon, and even this group of women with poor response, their response may not be same in every cycle. The response can be, each cycle may have a different response. So it is worth trying for this group of patients. High cost of treatment and emotional stress in this group of women with poor response need to be considered while counseling for these patients in order to retain them in the treatment protocols. IVF and ICSI is the best treatment which we can offer to this patient with the highest probability of pregnancy, and we should not be wasting time on timed intercourse or IUI in this group of patients. Suboptimal response should be identified and evaluated properly so that we can give this group of patients of group 1 and 2 a better response in the subsequent cycle. Young group 3 Posidon, they have a very good chance of pregnancy, although they have a poor reserve. Gonadotrophin can support only the growth of cohort which are already present in the ovary, but they cannot induce the de novo production of follicle. We have to understand the limitation of the dose of gonadotrophins which is going to be given. So, and the lots of studies have shown that beyond 300 IU, we are not going to benefit because the gonadotrophin can stimulate only the follicles which are there. If the follicles do not exist, the gonadotrophins are unable to stimulate these follicles. They can never compensate for your reduced ovarian reserve. More than 300 IU, there is no advantage. There is no solid data to recommend which is a magic bullet protocol for this patient, whether it's an agonist or an antagonist or a dual stim protocol. So embryo accumulation looks good, but it is a costly affair. Duostim again looks promising, but we are in preliminary stages of these duostim protocols. All the available adjuvants in poor responders, they may be beneficial, but we need more RCTs to recommend the routine use. However, there may be a subset of patients who may benefit. So these adjuvants, it is worth a try. So preliminary optimistic reports are there on autologous PRP injection, stem cell therapy, and in vitro activation of the oocytes in these patients, but we need more further RCTs and prospective trials to apply this into our routine use. Thank you. With this, we come to the end of our talk.
Yeah, Dr. Kiran is back. Dr. Kiran had a small technical issue, so he was just readmitted when he asked for it. So if Dr. Kiran is not there, ma'am, I would identify myself as S. Kumar.
Okay, yes, Dr. Kumar, yeah.
Yeah, I work as a vice president for Shield Healthcare.
Okay.
Because Dr. Kiran is back. Kiran, can you please unmute yourself? Kiran? He is showing on the stamp size picture, ma'am, but he was supposed to take the Q&A.
Okay.
For the sake of audience's time, may I ask you, may I reproduce the questions on behalf of Dr. Kiran, ma'am? I just read out the questions that are coming.
Yeah, we can take. Okay.
Yeah, the first question is from Dr. Vandana.
Okay.
And just a second, ma'am. And she is asking, is there any upper limit for number of stimulations we can offer women? Is there any other long-term effect of these multiple stimulations? From Dr. Vandana.
Okay. So see, upper limit is very difficult to say. We have to sit down and talk to the patient because see, most often what I have seen is usually the patient give up after 5 to 6 stimulations. So we have to talk to the patient. It depends on the cost of the treatment, if she is able to bear the cost of the treatment. Second, emotionally, even if they are able to bear the cost, emotionally they might be drained to continue with the treatment. So you there is no long-term side to answer her second question. There's no long-term side effects of this multiple stimulation. We are not going to compromise her ovarian reserve. As we say that ovarian follicular genesis, it happens in waves. All these follicles, they actually start to grow. A number of follicles are growing and the body is producing enough of FSH to help or support the growth of 1 or 2 follicles. So the other follicles, they undergo atresia. But when we are giving this additional FSH, exogenous FSH, it's going to stop the atresia of the follicles and support the growth of these follicles. So by going for this stimulation, we are not going to compromise her ovarian reserve in the future in any way. So there are no serious, any long-term side effects of this multiple stimulation.
Thank you, Dr. Sweta. The next question is from Dr. Madhuprita. Do duration of stimulation affect the outcomes, or how long can any patient be stimulated?
So see, duration of stimulation, we don't go by the number of days of injection. We go by the size of the follicle. So once we have 3 or 4 follicles which are 17, 18 mm in size, that's when we will trigger and go for collection. It can happen at 8 days of stimulation. It can happen at 10 days of stimulation. It can happen at 11 days of stimulation. It can happen any length of time. So it's more we go by the size of the follicles than the number of days of stimulation. And sometimes, even after 10 days of stimulation, if you see the follicles are 15 or 16 mm in size, we can go ahead with the stimulation for another 1 or 2 days before we go for the egg collection.
Thank you again, Dr. Sweta. The next question is from Dr. Sushila Khunte. From which day of cycle to start luteal phase estrogen dose and how long to continue?
So luteal phase estrogen, we start from day 25 of the previous cycle, the index cycle when we are doing in 2 milligrams twice a day. We continue it and for 1 day before we start the gonadotrophins.
Thank you, Dr. Sweta. The next question is from Dr. S. Jayashree. Madam, how do you...
I just answered this question. I think
sorry.
luteal phase synchronization, yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, again, the next question.
Yeah, Dr. S. Jayashree is asking the question. Madam, how do you give estrogen in luteal phase for synchronization of cycle?
Yeah. See, I just answered that question where we started from day 25 of the previous cycle and continue it for 1 day before the gonadotrophin.
Thank you, Dr. Sweta. Dr. Rekha Gupta, madam, is asking the next question. If the patient with endometriosis is unaffording, can we give letrozole 5 mg for 2 months as pre-treatment instead of long-acting GnRH analog?
Yeah, you can give if the patient is, but see, it's not going to make much difference in this group of patients because the cost is going to be same. Even if you're giving a long-acting GnRH agonist, even letrozole is not very cheap. So if you're going to give letrozole for 2 months, it's going to come out effectively little bit difference. It's going to make for the cost, but you can give, no problem.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Dr. Rekha Rajendra Kumar, Bangalore. What is luteal phase estrogen concept in one of your slides? Isn't luteal phase estrogen used as pre-treatment suppression for next stimulation? How to give pre-treatment suppression of OCPs followed by estradiol tap?
Yeah, so the same thing, I answered that question before, where because in these patients who are poor responders, as we know, they have got shorter cycles. Sometimes the FSH levels, they begin to rise in the late luteal phase. So because of the rising FSH levels in the late luteal phase, some of the follicles may start to grow. And once the patient menstruates and you start your stimulation, there would be few follicles which have already started to grow. And then when you start your stimulation, you get asynchronous cohort of follicles. And that's what may lead to your poor stimulation and poor egg collection. So that's why we recommend giving luteal phase estrogen in order to have better synchronized cohort in your antagonist stimulation cycle. And with the OCPs, see lots of the Grisinger and his group had given lots of data which shared that if we give OCPs beyond 14 to 16 days, it can cause a lot of endogenous suppression of the LH and your HPO axis is suppressed. So the patient may not respond very well in your stimulation cycle. So the pre-treatment suppression of OCPs should not be more than 14 to 16 days. And if you want to use estradiol after the pre-treatment suppression, after 5 days of stopping the OCPs, you can start the estradiol tablet then.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Dr. Dev Kumar. How do you initiate a random start at luteal stimulation in the presence of a dominant follicle?
So you see the luteal phase, the duostim, what we talked about is we initially give the patient, we give an antagonist protocol, and then once we give an agonist trigger in this group of patients, and then we do the egg collection. We give a break of 5 days and then start the second luteal phase stimulation. And we give this GnRH agonist, what is given is going to cause luteolysis of the corpus luteum and helps in the second phase of the luteal stimulation. So that's what you have to do.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Dr. Lalita Kotari. What is the role of DHEAs in premature ovarian failure?
In DHEA in the premature ovarian failure, again, when the patient has a poor ovarian reserve, Gleicher and his group had initially said that using DHEA, DHEA gets converted to testosterone, and that testosterone, as we know, has some role to play in the ovarian follicles. It helps the follicles more sensitive. The androgens which are present in the ovarian follicles, they make the follicles more sensitive to the FSH which we give. It increases the number of FSH receptors on the granulosa cells, so that this FSH response to the stimulation is better. DHEA acts as a precursor to the testosterone. So DHEA gets converted to testosterone in the ovaries and helps in giving a better ovarian response in our stimulation cycle. So that was an idea which was given by Gleicher and his group initially. So what Gleicher showed that there was increase in AMH, there was better response to stimulation, better embryo quality in this group of patients. But later studies have shown that DHEA was not so useful. And now the more recent studies are on using testosterone for improving the ovarian stimulation. Recent studies from 2018 and 19 are more in favor of using testosterone. And we are waiting the T-Transport trial from Polizos and his group, which is a big randomized trial looking at using the testosterone for 2 months, for 60 days prior to the stimulation. Because with testosterone, although the results, initial results of testosterone looks very promising, but data what we have is of higher doses and for very short period of time. So this group of polydors is looking at giving it for 2 months. So DHEA as such now may or may not have a role in this group of patients, but it is worth a try if you would like to use for your patients. But definitely testosterone is the way forward. That's what it looks like.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is again from Dr. Dev Kumar. If going for duostim during the egg retrieval after follicular phase stimulation, we will be only retrieving oocytes from the larger follicles. Can you elaborate on what is defined as large follicles and what size follicles are we leaving behind for the luteal phase stimulation?
So when we are going for duostim in the first stimulation, we are going to retrieve all the follicles which are more than 12-13 mm in size. Any follicles which is around anything beyond 12 mm are the follicles which we are going to look for retrieval. Particularly if you see any follicle which is 14 mm or more can give you a good mature egg. So anything more than 12-13 mm are all those follicles which are any follicle, I would say, wherever follicular aspiration is possible, all of these follicles which you are going to look for collection.
Thank you, ma'am. And here is a compliment from Dr. Jyoti Budi. She was testing audio at the beginning and she says, it's always nice to hear from Dr. Sweta, my friend.
Yeah, thank you, Jyoti. She's a really good friend. Yeah.
Getting back to the next question in a moment, ma'am. Dr. Riddhi Garg. Ma'am, in duostim, the dose you said is 450 U, but Eshrey says max dose in 4 responders should be 300.
See, that was a protocol what probably those group of people, in that also there was only 300 IU. 300 IU was used in the duostim protocol there. Some protocols have used 450 IU, but that was the trials what they did was with 450 IU. But in poor responders, HMG and 300 IU is what we should be following now. So most of the studies have shown that beyond 300 IU, we may not be able to it will not make any difference to the number of oocytes what we retrieve, but it's just going to increase the cost to the patient.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Dr. Preeti Dasarathan. What are the various methods of dealing with asynchronous follicles?
So the way the asynchronous follicles, it is the best way is to use the luteal phase estrogens. This is what most of us are following. The other one is to use the oral contraceptive pill. But again, you know, it might, with the OC pills, again, the LH levels goes down. The HPO axis is suppressed if you use beyond 15, 16 days. And another option to have a more synchronized cohort is to time your cycles is to use medroxyprogesterone 10 milligram twice a day from day 15 for a week to 10, for 7 to 10 days you can use to prepare your cycles.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is again from Dr. Dev Kumar. What are the technical difficulties during egg retrieval after luteal phase stimulation in duostim?
They should not be. It will be like a routine egg pickup procedure what you would do with your follicular stimulation as well. So whatever the follicles are there, which are anything more than beyond 12 mm, you are going to go for the pickup in this group of patients again. So your egg pickup will be very much similar to the follicular phase stimulation.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is not from a name. The doctor has chosen to display the phone Galaxy J7 Next. The question is, LH can be replaced by HCG?
Yes, we can replace LH by HCG. That will reduce greatly the cost of your treatment. You can give about 100 to 150 IU of HCG daily from the start of your stimulation to replace the LH.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Dr. Zubaida Abdul Qadir Ahmad. The question is dual trigger in fresh or frozen cycles?
Fresh or frozen. Dual trigger is always in a fresh cycle. Again, if you are using a frozen cycle, if you're using a stimulated frozen cycle, you may not look at dual trigger. In that, a single trigger is enough. We're talking about dual trigger in fresh cycle.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Dr. Sushila Kunte. Dose of transdermal testosterone. How long to give? When to start and stop? can it be beneficial for low ovarian reserve due to endometriosis?
So her first question is a dose, a transdermal testosterone. We can use 1% gel. You start 21 days in the previous cycle to the stimulation cycle. And when you start your stimulation, you stop the testosterone gel. And definitely it is beneficial from whatever data we have for now. It may be beneficial for patients with low ovarian reserve, and you can give it to all the patients of low ovarian reserve, not only endometriosis or any other group of patients with low ovarian reserve. We can use the testosterone gel.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question is from Dr. Sudha Jyoti. In dual trigger, which is the analog and what dose?
So in dual trigger, we use both the GnRH agonist and the antagonist, both agonist and antagonist. In the dual trigger, we use both HCG and GnRH agonist. HCG, you will give your 10,000 IU, and your agonist, you can use either triptorelin 0.2, or you can use berserolin 0.5, or you can use one leuprolide acetate 1 milligram.
Dr. Preeti, he is having the next question. Why is there better response while adding LH after 35 years? Normally, does LH receptor or bioactivity of LH decreases? Why cutoff of 35 years?
Yeah, so that's what is the reason why, they need a little bit of LH for, as we know, the LH is needed for the ovarian steroidogenesis. Probably the LH activity is a little bit lower in this age group of patients. So yes, definitely adding LH is what is beneficial in this group of patients.
Next is Dr. Sushila Kunte. Oral DHEAs versus testosterone gel in less ovarian reserve in endometriosis, which will give good results, can both be combined.
Sorry, what is the question? Oral DHEA versus testosterone
gel.
So both cannot be combined. Either you give oral DHEA or you give testosterone gel. One of the two.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Sudha Jyoti. Which do you follow, agonist or antagonist in poor responders?
See, it depends, if you would have used antagonist protocol in one cycle and if you did not get a good response, then you can go for a agonist in the subsequent cycle. We follow both. We do agonist as well as antagonist, both the cycles in poor responders.
Next is a compliment, Dr. Nadia Fadil Nasser. Thank you very much for the informative lecture. The next is to Dr. Govindlal Agarwal. Very nicely presented. The next is from Dr. Sivan Kumar Kumarapillai. Thank you, ma'am. Very good information. Dr. Sudha Jyoti. Do you give pre-treatment with vesicles?
No, I don't like pre-treatment with the pills. We don't give pre-treatment with the pill.
Dr. Nadia also compliments you for the nice presentation. Dr. Sunita, thank you, ma'am. Great talk. Deepa Patil, thank you, ma'am. Excellent presentation. Dr. Kiran, supposed to please unmute me. Yeah, we were searching for you, and yes, Dr. Nitisha.
But Kiran is back.
Yes.
Oh.
Tired. Quarantine for a minute or so. Yeah, from Dr. Nitisha's question onwards. Thank you, audience. Thank you, Dr. Sweta, for allowing me to represent the questions in the absence of Dr. Kiran.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Your voice is breaking, Kiran. Yeah. 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 Yeah, definitely. See, there we are talking about oxidative stress, reactive oxygen species, and mitochondrial dysfunction as one of the reasons. So that's where the coenzyme Q has a role to play. So in the recent years, in the last 5 years, we've got lots of studies which have looked at using coenzyme Q as a rescue for this oxidative stress. And we are using this coenzyme Q in doses of 300 milligrams twice a day. So the study which I presented from 2018 from Zhu and his group, which used 200 milligrams 3 times a day, 60 days prior to the index cycle. So we can either use 200 milligrams 3 times a day or 300 milligrams twice a day in this group of patients. So see, with this group responders, there is no concrete what we can say is adjuvants. We cannot say that these are the ones which are going to work, and we cannot say that these are the set of adjuvants which are not going to work. There must be one subset of patients in which some adjuvants work, and in another subset of patients the other adjuvants work. So we need more data to identify the subsets in which they are work. So probably I think growth hormone has a role, testosterone has a role, coenzyme Q has a role. All of these have a role to play to our responders. We just need to identify which subset, which adjuvant is going to work. Using leucine. Okay, the amino acids, leucine, you mean. Yeah, I mean, say that we're talking about using L-arginine and all of these amino acids. Again, how do they act? They are the nitric oxide precursors. So they are going to improve the any kind of, they are going to be they are going to relax the blood vessels, improve the blood flow. So there is probably some role of L-arginine and all these vasoactive agents and leucine and all to improve the blood flow. We are talking about in patients with thin endometrium also, using these vasoactive agents to improve the endometrial blood flow, to improve the endometrial receptivity. So there may be a role to play even in ovarian blood, improving the ovarian blood flow and ovarian response. So maybe there may be a role. We need to do more studies to look at that. See, with a patient with a low ovarian reserve, I have done cycles even up to a patient with 0.2 and 0.1 AMH also. And we had successful pregnancies and even live birth. I have patients with such low AMH who have the genetically related children. I have seen live births also. So I would not say that there is a cutoff of AMH where we have to say no, maybe at least 0.1, 0.2, I have personally treated. So we can go for stimulation in this particular group. And of course, you have to counsel the patient that how keen is she for a genetically related child and how much she has got financial resources to support that kind of treatment. So a patient with AMH of 1 can give up a treatment and go for donor cycle, and a patient with an AMH of 0.1 or 0.2 can still continue for a stimulation and not look at a donor at all. So we have to individualize the patient, we have to discuss with the patient, give her the realistic option, and then according to her desire, we have to go ahead with the treatment. So I wouldn't say there is any cutoff, but at least up to 0.1 or 0.2 AMH, you can still try. That's my personal experience. Yeah, we did talk about real trigger. Yeah. But PRP, what is she talking? Platelet rich plasma. Yeah. We recently started looking at a few patients in the last 1 year where they had PRP injected into the ovaries the response was good. They had the FSH drop down, the AMH looked better. Not much effect on the AMH, I would say, in the group of patients which we have seen, but definitely the day 2 FSH was lower in this group patient. They had better antral follicle count, but however, I haven't seen this to convert into the pregnancy rate. The better pregnancy rate or live birth rate have not increased, but definitely the FSH has improved, the AHC has improved in this group of patients. So we are in very preliminary stages to say that PRP works, but it is definitely worth a try, I would say. It's not very expensive, particularly in those patients who do not want to go for donor oocytes, who are looking at genetically related children. Maybe giving intra-ovarian PRP is something which they can look at. The local Shanghai protocol, again, in that they used more of they used the clomiphene and the letrozole. So because when the patients have very low ovarian reserve, when we use, or some studies have shown that using oral ovulogens in higher doses, or a combination of two different ovulogens such as clomiphene and letrozole both. So as we know, clomiphene acts with a different pathway and letrozole acts with a different pathway. So what people, some studies, what some people have done is they use higher doses of oral ovulogens instead of gonadotropins for stimulation to reduce the cost of the Duostin protocol. That's all. Different patient profile. You mean the question is relation to poor responders or generally anybody? Generally, see, so somebody who's going to come to you for the first time, she's a fresh young girl, so that's somebody who I would use clomiphene or letrozole both. In PCO patients, letrozole is a drug of choice, what we are saying nowadays, but some group of patients may respond better to clomiphene than to letrozole. So clomiphene definitely has a role to play, but with letrozole coming into the market back in the last few years, the use of clomiphene has gone down, but still clomiphene is to stay in the market. And when you talk about poor responders, in poor responders, when you're talking about using oral ovulogens for stimulation, what studies have shown is when you use clomiphene, they do better as opposed to letrozole, because letrozole is going to cause monofollicular development and clomiphene is going to cause multifollicular development. So when you're looking at oral ovulogens in poor responders, clomiphene is a better oral ovulogen compared to letrozole. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, OCP alone, but some people like to use combination. I don't like to use combination. I prefer not to use OCP in my cycles. I always prefer using luteal phase estrogen. And if I'm looking at a withdrawal bleed, I prefer using medroxyprogesterone for a withdrawal rather than an OCP. Again, it's taking into context the waves of folliculogenesis. So when they are multiple wave, we are talking about multiple waves of folliculogenesis, where it is what they say is a continuous growth, or it is like the continuous recruitment theory. So according to which the follicles continuously grow and regress in an ovarian cycle. So with a random start protocol, we can start the stimulation instead of just starting on day 2 or day 3. So we can just start the patient whenever she presents to us. It can be a day 3, day 4, or a day 5 start. Whenever in an ovarian cycle a patient is presenting, you can have a random start. See, there is a IVF, and when you do the pooling, we go for back-to-back cycles. We do pool pickup in this cycle, and then in the subsequent cycle, we do the pickup, and then we pool all the embryos and transfer in the third cycle. There is no benefit from waiting, giving a few months of break. It's not going to be beneficial unless the patient wants a break and wants to wait. But whenever we are having collection cycles, we like to do back-to-back, no waiting, but we can give a gap of 1 or 2 months if a patient wants between the pickup and the embryo transfer. But going back to back is the best way to save time, because these patients with poor responders, they already have very low reserve. So we don't want to delay the treatments in this group of patients. Quite a few times, yeah. Cannot hear. There is lot of background.
Please mute others. Please mute others.
Yeah. No, no problem. No problem. Okay. See, you can go for either dual stimulation is something which is very new. It looks very promising. So in the patients with such low AMH, obviously 2 or 3 cycles of stimulation and embryo pooling will be a good option. So when you're looking at pooling of your embryos, either you can do consecutive cycles every month to collect the embryos and pool your embryos, or you can go for duostim, where in one cycle itself you can pool the embryos. So between embryo pooling in consecutive cycles or a duostim protocol for pooling, it's just the time frame. In duostim, you're collecting embryos which you would get in 2 cycles in one ovarian cycle itself. So you're not wasting 1 month, and you can go for embryo transfer in the subsequent cycle. But when you're doing in consecutive collection cycles, you're going to do it over a period of 2 months. So it's just the time frame which is going to make difference. When we can do it in one cycle with duostim, then it is better to go for a duostim protocol. See, it's not just that, it's not the dose of HCG does not depend upon the number of follicles. Whether you have 5 or 10 follicles, your dose of HCG is going to be same. So when we do the IUI cycle, we do it 5,000, and when we do the IVF cycle, we go for the 10,000. See, you can use HMG or you can use recombinant FSH plus LH. If you use recombinant FSH and LH, your cost of the treatment is going to be very high. With HMG, your cost of the treatment is going to be low. And these poor responders, usually you're going to end up using 300 IU in your protocols. So using 300 IU of recombinant FSH plus LH is going to be very high cost of the treatment. So whenever we go for poor responders, HMG is preferred because to reduce the cost of the treatment, and number of studies have shown that whether you use HMG or recombinant, it's not going to make much difference to your stimulation. Yeah, yeah. No, no, it's not essential that you should give OCP with the testosterone gel. You can just give testosterone gel by itself. Sorry, I don't understand the question. Where is what's okay. Okay, I think there are two different questions. One is what is the dose of HCG to stimulate with RFSH? So yeah, when we are giving recombinant FSH, instead of using LH, you can use HCG 150 to 200 IU. You can use it. That's the dose of HCG. And when you're going to, what is the trigger in such cycle? Given by, you can give either HCG or you can use dual trigger, both. You can use agonist plus HCG trigger, or you can go for HCG trigger, because the dose of HCG which you're using is not going to result in trigger. That's 150 to 200 IU of HCG is not going to trigger your cycles. See, IUI best timing is normally when you're going to give the trigger, the ovulation is going to happen around 40 to 42 hours of the trigger. So the best time if you're doing a single IUI, it's around 40 hours. Yeah, 40 minutes of question discussion. And it's my pleasure. Sure, sure, definitely. We can share. Yeah, definitely, definitely. I hope, yeah, I think it will be useful, I think, for lots of, because there's so much in the area of poor responders, which is still we need to know more about it, I guess. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure, sure. Okay. Thank you, Kiran and the entire team of Shield to giving me an opportunity to connect with everyone. And also, I would thank all the viewers that they're still connected with us even at the end of like 1 hour 45 minutes. So it's really nice. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, sure, sure. I look forward to it, Kiran. Thank you so much.